In this episode of the UNFC podcast, we're going to be drilling down into the practical application of the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources, or UNFC. With the European Union's recent Critical Raw Materials Act, a UNFC assessment has become mandatory for companies seeking to have their project designated as strategic.
To help us navigate this evolving landscape, we're very pleased to have Ben Lepley from SLR Consulting with us today. Ben's expertise with UNFC has been helping clients with their CRMA strategic project applications, which of course involves this component. We're thrilled to explore this unique insight with Ben. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you both, and it's good to be here. Ben Lepley, and I'm from SLR, as we said. I was a geologist for a long time, working in resource geology for mining companies and exploration companies. And then I saw the green light and moved towards the environmental, social, and governance ESG world. And I'm helping exploration and mining companies still, but look at their environmental and social impacts and how to manage them.
Awesome. And I guess through that finding of the green light and everything along, that particular and very key element of the metals and mining sector, how did that bring you to the CRMA and UNFC? Because I guess that's some of the first circles that you and I met in personally as well.
Yeah, so obviously through my ESG work, we have to look at legislation, and the CRMA was a big one that landed that we knew was going to have quite big impact on exploration and mining companies, particularly in Europe, but also worldwide. And in terms of the UNFC side of things, that's something I've always been interested in, but it's always been in the background because very few companies, if any, actually were using the UNFC to report and classify their resources and reserves, particularly in the mining world. So I knew about it, but it was never really something we used. But it was only until the CRMA came out and everyone said, oh, we've got to use the UNFC now. We thought, well, we better read up on what that actually is and how we actually implement it and help our clients through that complicated world. So, yeah, that's how I got into it. And we've managed to help a few of our clients to navigate the strategic project application process, which was quite tricky at times, and particularly because it was the first round and maybe they had a few teething issues and complexities of the application form, etc. But eventually we got there.
How did you sort of find an experience going through that with your clients then?
The actual process itself of writing the form was extremely difficult because it just for technicalities on the way the form was created was awful. But the information they were asking for was not difficult, and our clients had that information to hand, and we were able to synthesize it into the relevant parts. I think some of the difficulties were trying to work out exactly what they wanted, because you can read all the words and you can understand the words, but what is that they're actually trying to get out of you was the kind of nuance that we were helping with, because that they were very capable of writing this themselves, but you had a defined character count, for example, which meant you could only write certain amount. You couldn't put any images in, you couldn't put any tables in, so you had to explain with words exactly how you're going to meet the requirements they're asking for a strategic project. So that was the real challenge, really. And it turned out in the end, of the three companies that I helped overall, none of them got approved, unfortunately, for various reasons. But there were some key themes running through it, which I'm sure we'll touch on.
Can I quickly dial back? Because I think actually we should possibly go over what exactly a strategic project is in the context of CRMA. Could you sort of flood some light on that?
So a strategic project is a project that's deemed a flagship project for the EU in terms of being able to fulfill a gap that currently the EU cannot, does not have the ability to fill at the moment. So these are generally projects that are in advanced exploration stage, and nearly ready to go, but have got a few hurdles to get through. And they're ones that are going to contribute materially. So they're going to provide a significant amount of metal for a specific critical mineral, and they're also going to be completed using all the environmentally and socially friendly methods. And that's a key theme running throughout the CRMA, is that projects need to be developed sustainably, which is great to see, obviously. So yeah, really it's about fulfilling gaps that the EU doesn't have, and trying to wean ourselves off some of the other sources around the world which maybe tend to dominate. And it depends on the commodity as well, because something like rare earth elements, which we don't really have any operational mines in Europe, even if it can contribute a small amount of that raw material, that is significant. Whereas something like copper, which maybe we have a lot more of and we have operational mines, it needs to be something quite significant to kind of be considered as a strategic project. And I guess we saw that, with a lot of lithium projects being granted a strategic project status, because again, we don't have that the supply within Europe at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on the critical minerals point. There's also this wonderful world in the critical minerals list for the EU of the strategic minerals, which is different from a strategic project, even though a strategic minerals list can be looked upon, there is some within the strategic project, it's a subset of our critical minerals. You kind of touched on there were challenges in the form. It's a brand new process. It is a teething issue. Ultimately, I think everybody involved is relatively understanding that this was a whole new process for a whole new body, and everybody is an actor involved. But of course, fringing on industry, there's an element of people who are used to their familiar processes. What you mentioned on just the formatting of the document, but in terms of content, what were some of those points that were really hard to speak to within that?
I think some of the key things, particularly for the projects I was working on, again, which were more advanced exploration, they didn't have a lot of things in place and they couldn't prove it. So things like offtake agreements, which were considered to be something, not a requirement to have a signed contract in place, but something where you have talks ongoing, or you have a list of potential off takers. So that was quite hard to demonstrate. But also some of the sustainability criteria, so the sustainability standards that it requires you to follow, because they're exploration projects, they're not as geared up towards exploration projects as they are operations. So things like IRMA, towards sustainable mining, copper mark, etc., they're really geared towards operations. So when you're trying to convince the panel and the experts who are reviewing them that you have everything in hand, and yes, you will in the future adhere to all these sustainability criteria, is difficult because they haven't signed up to one at that present time. They're not sure which one is most relevant at the time. So yeah, those are probably some of the key challenges, I would say, as well as just some of the unknowns. And the whole point of this really was of strategic projects is to help with the permitting process, which, as everyone knows, can take a horrifically long time. So part of it was trying to fast track projects through the permitting process, but you had to really try and explain in the form how long things are going to take, why you needed strategic project status to help you advance those timelines, and that's all about the capacity of that government or the authority in that country, their ability to actually process the applications and have the relevant experienced people. So in some cases it's just a big unknown, which is one of the reasons they were applying in the first place. So yeah, a few challenges there.
And that's quite an interesting point about there's that kind of like jurisdictional coupling and decoupling going on in this in the permitting process and in those sustainability standards as well. Data granularity can be a big part of specific standards, and that can really feed into that kind of maturity journey. But data granularity isn't necessarily representative of sustainable performance in many ways. Naturally we like to understand how, with metric tracking, but it's not everything with respect to it. In terms of the UNFC piece fitting into the strategic project application, because that's part of both the application process and then the kind of monitoring element, what was the experience of taking clients through some of those processes like? Because again, this is something that's new to a lot of the minerals sector, certainly the industry side of it. What was that like?
Yeah, well, I obviously had to educate myself before the client, which was as long as I was one step ahead, it was okay. But going through all those documents, and really it was about converting their existing reporting of mineral resources and reserves into UNFC. So using some of the ones that are used widely, so the JORC code, CIM requirements in Canada, SAMREC in South Africa, etc., PERC in Europe. So if they already had, and in the cases that I was dealing with, they already had reported resource and reserves that we could use as a basis. That it was then going through that bridging document that was created, going from what are termed as CREASCO umbrella of organizations, which includes all those I just mentioned, and bridging between that and UNFC. And when you boil it all down, there's a lot of similarities, obviously. It's just some of the terminology that's different, and there's things like degree of confidence in your resource and what's in the ground. That's directly translatable. There's the technical feasibility side of things, which is again directly translatable, even though it's slightly different terminology. And then I guess the key thing that's different is the E-axis, which I think most people were quite concerned about. But the UNFC does give a lot of good guidance, and it gives you criteria and sub-criteria in order to assess which kind of level you're at. And it was quite prescriptive in that regard. So unlike some of the other codes, actually, I think it's a lot more prescriptive in terms of what you actually have to report on and how you convert things from the existing JORC code or whatever into UNFC terms.
That's a really fascinating insight, I feel, into, I guess, the free access F and G being the technical feasibility and the geological knowledge, and they're the easy, I don't want to say easy to map, but like much more simple and clear possibly to map between CRISCO codes and UNFC. But then you've gone on to the E-axis, which is the dreaded E-axis, perhaps. Yeah. So how did you sort of feel the balance was there, sort of between E, F, and G? I know I'm very much in this case focusing on sort of where does E fit, and where are you mapping that from, or are you having to generate that from scratch, that information required for E?
Well, yeah, that's where it does bring in a lot more information from other sources. So your JORC report or your report of resource and reserves will have a certain amount of information, but it probably won't have everything. Thinking about things like social license to operate, that's a key part of it. Does your project have acceptance in the local area? These are topics that should be assessed in those reports anyway, to some degree, but they're not quite as obvious and blatant as the UNFC tries to make them. So yeah, as well as the environmental and social, you also have the economic side of things, and that should be again included if you have reserves in particular. But for some of the ones that only had resources reported, you might not have the depth of knowledge on the economic side of things, which may impact your ability to come up with the correct kind of E number. I think it just one thing as well is on going back to the form, and I don't want to tear it to pieces, but one of the most annoying things was you could only put one categorization in for the entire project, right? And for any resource or any project out there that has resource and reserves reported, there are more often than not, there's several categories reported. So this could be, measured, indicated, inferred, probable, and proven for the reserve side. But you had to choose one, which was your one that you put on the form, right? And you also had to include a UNFC assessment form separately from the actual application form, which did allow you then to go into a bit more detail. But I had a few communications with the EU about this, or European Commission, and they said, yeah, basically just whatever's the most dominant one, go for that. So it could be that you have a small amount of measured resource, which is the highest level of confidence you have, and then no indicated, and then loads of inferred, for example. And in that case, you're kind of stuck thinking, well, it's quite unfair, really, to call it all inferred, even though that's the dominant one. But could we call it somewhere in between? Maybe. And that was one thing that caught us all out, I think, was the ability to not have that. But going back to the actual, process of selection of strategic projects, the UNFC was only used as a kind of as a baseline. Like, here you are now. I think you mentioned earlier, Chris, it's something that will be monitored in the future. And obviously projects change as more data becomes available, as the economics change, as the social environment changes. And projects will be expected to move through different UNFC categories as a result. So it is just used as a basis. And even if you had a low score according to the UNFC in your application form, it wasn't then as if you would be kicked out for having a project that was never going to get anywhere, because that's just the current status, and you would have to explain how you're going to get to the next steps. And that was another part of the form, was really understanding, yes, here we are right now, but here are the next steps to get to the next level, be that completing a feasibility study to get the F-axis up, be it doing a lot more stakeholder engagement and advancing your environment and social impact assessment to get the E-score up, for example.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. So there's a member that used to work for the UNEC that I've always enjoyed talking to about this, and there were other people who first sort of really introduced me to the complexities of UNFC. But in their eyes, they used to describe UNFC as a tool that's really a scenario analysis tool, and I always end up calling it ladders in 3D, which is essentially, part of their view of how the tool could be used effectively is this, not just the progress monitoring of a project, but to start thinking about some risk management perspectives in terms of what is it that could happen to knock you down categories, and what could accelerate, your snakes, and what could accelerate you up them, your ladders. I thought it was quite interesting the way you kind of touched on social license, and others will talk about social acceptance or shared value creation opportunities, that kind of social element of sustainability, and maybe there being everything talked about quite neatly and as if it's a very tangible thing, where it can feel quite difficult to articulate the social element of sustainability sometimes. As I've just proven in that slight pause there, are there any pieces of guidance or kind of broadening it out from UNFC, or things that you'd like to see integrated into that conversation to see it become more of a part of the E-axis, or easier to integrate, or even just easier to articulate within it?
There's a lot of standards out there that are being used across the board, and I mentioned a few of them already. IRMA and TSM and Coppermark, whatever. They have best practice in there, and they have what they're expecting you to have if you want to be a high achiever, and if you want to get a good kind of mark in those standards, as it were. So there's so many different standards out there which can help a company in terms of what's expected as a best practice. And I think across the board, it is improving in terms of companies understand, in order to get their mine permitted, they're going to have to put a lot more effort into talking with communities and getting that social acceptance included. And that was one of the main criticisms that I've seen across across some of the NGOs and other groups who are concerned about the CRMA, was the fact that if you become a strategic project, do you get precedence over that land, for example? And I'm thinking, because a few of my projects I worked on were up in northern Sweden and in Scandinavia, where you have indigenous people living there, the Sami peoples. They were one of the very vocal groups who were saying, well, we have access based on very old legislation that we are allowed to freely, roam these lands with our reindeer, for example. Will these projects now be getting precedent over our activities just because they become strategic projects? And that's a real deep concern, and one that I don't think has been fully addressed since then. So that's something I'm quite cautious about in terms of celebrating strategic project. And we've seen some of the other projects. I won't name them, but there's been some huge social kickback against some of the projects that are now approved. And how are they going to navigate that that landscape where there's massive social opposition to certain projects, and just because it's been deemed strategic does not make a difference for the people that live there. So that's something I'm keen to follow. But I think again, making sure that that there are standards that are being used across the board, and make sure those standards are applicable for exploration projects as well as mining projects would be a key step forward. Things like environment social impact assessments, which for most jurisdictions now is a requirement in order to get a permit to operate. The level of quality of those needs to be standardized, or a certain level needs to be achieved before they can get those status, I think. So we'll probably come on to the challenges of projects outside the EU in a bit, but that's one of the key challenges I see there as well.
Yeah, I think you raise a point. It reflects the broader CRMA and strategic projects. You kind of called them the flagship of the act in many ways, and I suppose they are. They're a point that everyone saw and really resonated with that. They're part of that economic fast track. Let's get into permitting being sped up. I'm sure the EU would say that a strategic project reflects the opportunity to speed up rather than it, saying it's a pre-approved project. But it is still something everyone will watch as part of that, particularly those first groupings come through. Before we go on to the wonderful world of outside of the EU, because as you rightly say, strategic projects aren't just limited to the EU, and also we're talking about UNFC, more broadly to some extent. Alex, I know you were talking about or had some interesting insights from other interviews about different commodities or different applications of UNFC as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess obviously you've focused on, I suppose you've said they're all extraction projects or all exploration. Like, do you have sort of your thoughts on UNFC's application to sort of beyond that, talking about, from the maybe to the refinery stage, sort of different place in the value chain, to even sort of secondary raw materials recycling and the like?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, and the whole point of the UNFC was to standardize it across a number of different sources, right? So that is one of the key reasons it's being used in this context, because there are multiple sources and types of material extraction that are being used. So in order to make that under one house, the UNFC was really the only tool that had that ability, which is why some of the terminology in it as well is a bit foreign to some mining people, because it's mainly been created with a focus on maybe downstream activities and refineries, like you say, and maybe recyclers as well. So it does just make things harder sometimes for the mining companies. But in terms of things like refineries, I think that the E and the F axes are very similar in terms of there's a project location, there's going to be a feasibility of that project that goes up through the different technical readiness levels, as they're called in the UNFC. And I think it's the G one that's slightly different in the case of some of these other ones. So what the degree of confidence that you have in creating the products, essentially. So that, for me, because I've never worked in it, unfortunately, I don't have experience of it, but I'm thinking in terms of if you're a scrap processor, for example, how do you guarantee the quality and the consistency of the feedstock? Where's it going to come from? What the environment and social attributes of that material? Are they from a credible source? Do you know how they've been collected and how they've been delivered to site, etc.? So I think that those are some of the key challenges. And one of the projects I worked on was actually a tailings reprocessing project. So it was slightly different to the normal kind of mining exploration remit, but it's kind of similar in terms of you've got a deposit in the ground, you've drilled it out, you kind of understand the size and the scale and the grade of it, etc., and then you're scooping it out and chucking it in a plant to put it very very simply. But that was slightly different as a result, because it was rehabilitating a site which previously was considered environmentally degraded because of the deposition of the tailings at the time. Didn't have any lining, for example, so there were potential impacts with groundwater and other environmental pollution sources. So that was slightly different. And I guess that there are, for all the different processing types and project types, there are different challenges. But for me, that G-axis was the one that I think, how do I actually go about dealing with that?
Well, that's some great insight. And the idea of and I guess it's sort of, you mentioned a tailings project, but I feel stuff like this is really, talk about maybe strategic project, the flagship thing, but I think for a lot of people it's really looking at sort of this recycling, substitution, secondary raw materials, anthropogenic raw materials. That's sort of where I think almost the CRMA is most exciting, possibly to some people. I don't know. I feel another area is, of course, the CRMA has a reach beyond Europe. In fact, in the country we're all in right now, the UK, you can get strategic projects sort of in non-member states. What do you sort of think about this development of sort of these non-member states?
Yeah, it's great in terms of, for them, they needed it basically, didn't they? Because everyone's well aware of the fact that Europe has a defined geology that's been there for millions of years, sometimes billions of years. There's only a defined number of projects that are going to be there that have been found, and there's been intense exploration all over the continent. And I'm sure there are projects that we haven't found, particularly deeper ones that take a lot more effort to find. But the major projects have probably been found nearer surface anyway. So they needed to look elsewhere in order to make sure some of those targets they set in terms of the proportion of mined material and proportion of processed material meets their targets. So the countries, I think there's 13 projects that were selected when they're outside the EU. Including the UK, as well as some other parts of Europe which aren't in the EU, but then Australia, Brazil, some southern Africa. So some of the key challenges I see there are obviously the control. So the EU doesn't have control over those countries. So how are you going to ensure that particularly things like the sustainability criteria are equivalent to what the EU would expect? So things like environmental impact assessments, again, the quality of those, because that varies considerably where you are in the world in terms of the requirements of the national legislation. How is that going to fit in with EU legislation, which is probably more stringent than a lot of those places? Although maybe Australia, the UK might be slightly different to that. So that's one challenge I have. And then some of the projects, if you've got something in Eastern Australia, I think it is, you're bringing that material halfway across the world. That's a long way. So ensuring that the sustainability in terms of things like greenhouse gas emissions and other pollution along the way, making sure that fits with what the EU wants to see as well, I think it is a bit of a challenge. And then the key thing, I think, over everything is permitting. And it's the same for the EU states, right? That all of them have to completely change their systems in order to fit in with this system. So all the permitting regimes, which generally are years long, are trying to get it down to 24 months. I think they is their target to try and get projects permitted. That 2-year period is already going to be challenging for most EU states. And I think a lot of countries are now desperately trying to work out how they're going to do that in terms of capacity, in terms of number of people, who's going to fund it, etc. Lots of questions there. But then the same applies to all these other third countries. So do they have the capacity? Do they have the right training to be able to process that those applications in the time frame required? One of the hurdles that my clients faced, and one of the reasons they were all rejected in the end, was the ability to get into production by 2030 or around 2030. So that was a key requirement in terms of the CRMA, and that was a downfall of lots of applicants, as I understand, being able to demonstrate you're going to be able to be into production by 2030. And that obviously includes additional technical work, environmental social impact assessment. Again, these things take a long time, but then the permitting part of it as well. And if that's included, it can take a lot longer. So it was difficult to see that, because one of the whole points of becoming a strategic project was to expedite, quicker permitting. So if they're struggling to get the permits already, that was one of their main reasons for doing it in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned it, because that feels, to many who would have not have had that experience of going through it, feels a bit chicken or egg. It's basically, have you already got to a position where
I wrote chicken and egg down here on my notes? So
So can I just ask, because you've opened a lot of questions in my head, but did you get that as specific feedback following on from that application process?
Yeah, so we got an assessment report back from them, as well as a letter saying, sorry, you've not been chosen, and these are the reasons. And then you got a brief summary of what the experts had fed back. So when the application went in, it was obviously vetted by people in the European Commission in terms of completeness. And then when something popped up. So it's vetted by the European Commission, then it goes on to the expert panel, and then they have, I think it's something like, because I actually applied to be an expert reviewer, and I was actually not able to in the end because I'm not an independent. So I kind of got to see some of the background to this, and you had 3 days to review each project essentially, and that would be there were 4 main areas: that environmental and social. There were economics, there was geology, and then there was technical feasibility. I believe those are the 4 categories. So you had, and then each expert then had 3 days. So you had this 3-day review, which I guess is a decent amount of time to get through the documentation, but it's still limited. And there was no discussion at all between the reviewers and the project proponents, which I think is another key flaw in the process.
That's really eye-opening, that level of what's sat behind it, because I don't think, when the projects list was released, there are a lot of people who went, I'm trying to see if there's a trend here and what's been selected and why, and it led to some degree of discussion of, I can't make sense of it for a lot of people. And I think actually some of that information you've just talked about in terms of what the process was behind makes sense, does help contextualize it. And the other word that, as you were talking earlier, you kept saying the word capacity. And I think that really resonated with this 2030 point you were raising, because there are people who have critiqued strategic projects and the UNFC role in that as well, around that fast tracking of permitting, and a concern, very validly, that it will lead to rushing. As a result, there's oversight, and that is how, in a sector like metals and mining, there can be, really negative repercussions that come out from it. So that capacity piece, when is really interesting, both from an EU perspective, other nations as well, about what the traditional permitting timelines are. I know you kind of alluded to it. Would you just mind, from your experience, telling us what the traditional permitting timelines normally are, to really give anybody who's not familiar with them that context of quite how much this is a replacement? I don't know, that's Elm's piece of strength, but
exactly, depending on which country you are, when you're doing it, etc. I think there's something like that. On average, across the globe, it takes 17 years on average to go from discovery to full permitting, if you're doing it continuously. So that is a long time frame. And for something that needs money each year, who is actually putting that money to it? I mean, it's craziness, really. The risk involved in mining projects, anyway. But most projects, thinking about Scandinavia in particular, where I do a lot of work in the European context, it's generally 2 to 4 years can be quite a normal kind of time frame, because not only have you got things like mining permits themselves and mining licenses, concessions, whatever they're called in that country, but you've also got environmental approvals, which is generally based on the impact assessment. And the impact assessment needs a certain length of a disclosure period where it needs to have consultation from stakeholders, including communities, local authorities, project workers, etc. And that consultation period can be extremely long anyway. And then after the consultation period, obviously, then the project proponent needs to go back and potentially make adjustments. They might have to reapply, even if they're successful. And we've seen that with some of our clients. They can be appealed, and if they're appealed, that can add another year on, in terms of going through all the courts. And they might be appealed in one court, but then have to, that gets rejected and then passed up to the next level of court, to the Supreme Court. And so it goes on. And depending on how much resistance there is, again, from the general public and from concerned stakeholders, that time can really just keep going ad infinitum.
Well, and I think this is an interesting point, and it again gets into, and in another episode we had a really interesting conversation with Tom Bide about this. The difference between what is the point of a UNFC strategic project application is it's not necessarily got a role in being entirely investor related, even though, of course, through the fast tracking of processes, it feels, of course, it has a massive interlink there. But again, there's that, what's UNFC about? What's the strategic project about? Is that operating at different policy level to where traditional resource reserve estimates have been going? And it leads to this almost, what's the classification about and who's it for, almost, in terms of like, who is the stakeholder being considered in these decisions?
Because I guess generally, when you're doing CRISCO related assessments, it's all about the investor. And really, that's what you're trying to do it for, is to show people, here we are, here's our project, here's why it's wonderful. Please invest in our project. So yeah, that's definitely from the CRISCO side of things, the main focus. But yeah, the UNFC, like you say, is slightly different.
Absolutely, I think. Yeah, I wonder, would you say, because in my head, listening to yourself speak, you've touched on that breadth of different standards, processes, different things going all around the world, and we're almost trying to, we've got different materials, we've got different resource codes, we've got different permitting processes, we've got different timelines, we've got different stakeholders, we've got different elements of the value chain. Do you see UNFC as having any potential role in the ability to standardize or unify and bring that together in a systems kind of approach, or do you think that's too far for the wonderful world of UNFC?
At the moment, I just don't see why companies would do it, because the codes are all changing and being updated, and a lot of that is around the ESG aspects and sustainability aspects, because quite rightly, in the past, it hasn't been considered as important, but now it's being recognized that, actually, we do need to beef this up a bit. So when you report resource reserve, you do need to now have a lot more information about those aspects. So I think that was one thing where it was lagging behind, but now is maybe catching up. And you've got to remember as well that again, these companies are using specific codes to report with in specific jurisdictions. So if they're listed in Toronto or in Canada somewhere, they have to adhere to those rules over there. So they have to report using the CIM guidance and form 43101, as it's called. So if they were going to do UNFC, that would be additional. They would have to do both. So I don't see how it can take over that, particularly the exploration and mining world, when these companies already have to report. If they're listed in certain areas, they have to report using one of those codes that already exist. But hopefully, now we've had a bit of exposure to it, and like probably most people, we haven't used UNFC on a specific project basis. And I know the BGS and some of the other geological surveys across Europe have used it in terms of trying to assess the countrywide resources in the ground and get an assessment of the varying qualities of projects. And I understand it from that perspective. And I think that's one area it probably will continue to be used, because it does have the standardization and is a lot more prescriptive, as I said earlier. But for individual projects and exploration and mining companies, I don't quite see it happening just yet. Sorry, UNFC.
No, that's fine. I think that we're all about transparency and being honest and frank here, and I don't think we wanted to have some sort of hive mind of groupthink. So having these actual very realistic perspectives is lovely, frankly. But like honestly, I don't know. Do you think that it will improve? Do you think things will actually go forward then? Because it's clearly, as you say, sort of early days. It's not really being applied to at a project level currently. Can you see it evolving and adapting? I'm not trying to force a bit of optimism in here, but there is a potential, I think, a way forward here, and I think it'll be sort of interesting to see how we get to, let's say, 2030, which I think you mentioned this sort of the timing of it all quite a bit, and I think that's big for the sustainable development goals and big for the CRMA.
I think it's going to depend on the success of the CRMA and the strategic projects. Because if they're a success, the UNFC will go hand in hand with that, and people will start to recognise it as something that could and maybe should be used for a lot more projects, and particularly with the standardisation across the different, mineral extraction techniques and refineries, recycling, etc. Being able to standardise, for a country to understand its resources. Again, that's why. I guess at a government level, it is a lot more useful to them. But I think if the CRMA is successful and starts to see these strategic projects kick forward and really start to make inroads into the supply deficit, which is the whole point of it. Again, is trying to wean ourselves or wean the EU off China and other dominant sources. If it is successful, then maybe the UNFC rides that wave and becomes successful as well. That's positive.
And I think thank you so much for joining us today, Ben, because it's been really insightful to get that industry perspective, particularly, and that's something that's been missing from these conversations. So I think there's nothing left to do but to say thank you so much for coming on and sharing your perspectives. We've got work to do in this space, but it's a process, and looking forward to seeing how it evolves. But thank you ever so much for coming on. Thank you ever so much for joining us on this episode of the UNFC podcast, exploring all of the practical implications of actually submitting strategic project applications with Ben Lepley. In the next episode, we'll be exploring the Crisco and UNFC relationship with Ed Sides. See you on the next episode.
The views, thoughts and opinions expressed by guests or contributors on the podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, Satarla and Critical Productions. Any statements made should not be interpreted as endorsements or official positions. Listener discretion is advised.